The lie actually doesn't start exactly on the goldfields. It starts in Sacramento, in the state capital, as a political weapon in partisan politics. And this was a time when Californians were nervous about more Chinese coming to the state. The gold rush attracted over 100,000 people from all corners of the globe. And in fact, there was a lot of fighting and competition on the gold fields, not just between white people and Chinese, but between everybody, because it was a fevered environment. And white Americans used nativism as an excuse for competition. So they drove out people from Mexico, they drove off the fields people from Chile, from France, from Belgium, from Australia, and the Chinese. But the Chinese question took on a special racial cast because it wasn't just that they were foreigners, but it was alleged that they were like slaves. And so there was something innately racial about them that people considered them to be basically unassimilable to American society.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society in partnership with the Boston Public Library, the Boston Book Festival, the State Library of Massachusetts, and ably produced by the GBH Forum Network. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, exploring Chinese immigration, global politics, and the gold rush. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring author and scholar May Ngai with moderator Jilin Yang. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society and producer of the American Inspiration Author Series. Now, from our partners at the State Library, Beth, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everyone. I'm Beth Carroll Horrocks, the head of Special Collections at the State Library of Massachusetts. We're very glad to be here tonight with our partners from American Ancestors, the Boston Public Library, and GBH Forum Network. Now, turning to introductions. Kristen?
Thank you, Beth. Welcome on behalf of the Boston Public Library. I'm Kristen Motti, a Programs Librarian at the Central Library of the Boston Public Library. We're very glad to be in partnership with American Ancestors, the State Library of Massachusetts, the GBH Forum Network as a part of this Boston Book Festival event. So now I have the privilege of telling you just a little bit about tonight's featured author, May Ngai. Professor May Ngai is Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and a Professor of History at Columbia University in New York. She is the author of the award-winning work, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, as well as The Lucky Ones, One Family and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America. We'll meet Professor Ngai in just a moment, but now to hear about our moderator, back to you, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Our moderator for this evening is no stranger to the topic of immigration and America. Jilin Yang is the author of the acclaimed work, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, 1924 to 1965. She is the national editor at the New York Times and was previously deputy national security editor at the Washington Post, where she was part of a Pulitzer Prize-winning team. As her celebrated book is a topic special to so many of us in this audience, we're making signed copies of her book available through Porter Square Books. You can order One Mighty and Irresistible Tide from portersquarebooks.com. Be sure to use the code AMINS20 if you want a signed copy. And we'll meet Jilin soon, but for now, May, welcome. It is really great to have you with us from New York, from your office at Columbia University. We are so honored. And to get us started for tonight, do you want to tell us briefly about your work and about the Chinese question? Over to you, and again, welcome.
Thank you, Margaret, and to Kristen for your kind introduction and for having me tonight. Let me start with just a few words about the Chinese question. The book is about the origins of the Chinese diaspora in the West, by which I mean the United States and the British dominions. I locate those origins in the gold rushes of the second half of the 20th century. I'm sorry, the second half of the 19th century. It's a story about the origins of these communities as well as the origins of anti-Chinese racism in the West. In Asian American studies, we know that the first Chinese who came in large numbers came during the California gold rush, but there's practically nothing written about it. I wanted to research this history in part because I wanted to challenge the so-called coolie myth, the idea that Chinese were indentured workers or slaves. That idea arose from the goldfields, although it was false, and was provided the justification for the Chinese exclusion laws. To slay the coolie myth, I had to make both an empirical case and a political case. My research extended from California to Australia and South Africa. In California and in the British colony of Victoria, Australia, I found it remarkable that Chinese gold seekers had similar methods of work and social organization, including hometown and family associations and secret brotherhood societies. These were instrumental in how the Chinese organized their daily lives, as well as their resistance to racism. In South Africa, Chinese were brought over as indentured workers, but they also showed similar social organization and resistance. Here's an example of the racist movement against the Chinese in Australia, which picked up on similar stereotypes from California. And finally, the man at the center of this photograph is Huang Zunxian, a Qing diplomat who was posted in San Francisco in the 1880s. He was instrumental in bringing a number of lawsuits against discrimination against the Chinese in the US, and he wrote a long poem in classical Chinese called The Expulsion of the Immigrants, which I cite throughout the book. So I'm so pleased to be here this evening and to have a conversation about the Chinese question with Jialin Yang, a writer who's written a lot about immigration and whose writings I very much admire. So thank you for joining me, Jialin.
Evening, everyone. First of all, congratulations to you, Professor Ngai, on this phenomenal book. Just like your other work, The Chinese Question is marked by an astonishing depth of scholarship, incisive analysis, and revelatory conclusions. It's all here in this book too. And just like your other work, I know that I'm going to be spending years thinking about what you found here. So I think the first thing I wanted to ask you is this lie that you just referred to, that the Chinese immigrants who came seeking gold were not, in fact, free laborers. Who created this lie? What purpose did it serve? And why has this notion persisted all this time? You know, you say at the beginning of the book, this is partly what inspired you to go down this decade-long research and writing journey.
The lie actually doesn't start exactly on the goldfields. It starts in Sacramento, in the state capital, as a political weapon in partisan politics. And this was a time when Californians were nervous about more Chinese coming to the state. The gold rush attracted over 100,000 people from all corners of the globe. And in fact, there was a lot of fighting and competition on the gold fields, not just between white people and Chinese, but between everybody, because it was a fevered environment. And white Americans used nativism as an excuse for a competition. So they drove out people from Mexico, they drove off the fields people from Chile, from France, from Belgium, from Australia, and the Chinese. But the Chinese question took on a special racial cast because it wasn't just that they were foreigners, but it was alleged that they were like slaves. And so there was something innately racial about them that people considered them to be basically unassimilable to American society. So this became weaponized in California politics in 1852 as part of the governor's reelection campaign. And it was a big lie. We know all about big lies in our own time. This was the big lie of the 1850s. And it was a big lie that had a long shelf life.
Why do you think it's persisted for so long? You describe a student even writing about this, and it struck you as, oh my goodness, I have to find a way to correct the record once and for all.
Well, I think there's two answers to that question. The one is that that big lie was actually reproduced in historical scholarship. Not continually since the 19th century, but in the 1960s, a book was written called Bitter Strength, which was about Chinese American history. It was written by a student of Oscar Handlin, who those of you in the Boston area will know about Professor Handlin, who is really the father of American immigration history. And Handlin had a theory about assimilation, that it was the norm for immigrants, but by which he meant European immigrants. And Barth's book said that the Chinese were the exception that proved the rule, that because they were unfree, because they were sojourners, that they could never really be assimilated into American society. So interestingly, Barth used as evidence for that claim certain testimonies that were given before the California State Senate in the late 1860s. Now, if you look at those testimonies, there's hundreds and hundreds of pages by all kinds of people, but he did something that is a big no-no in history, which is he cherry-picked the quotes that he liked, the ones that agreed with his point of view. And you would never know unless you went back to read it, that there were all kinds of points of view in those testimonies, which is itself an interesting question, right? Why do so many people have different points of view? So subsequently, scholars just cited Barth, and they cited the same testimonies as though they had never read the original source themselves. So that's how it persisted in the literature. But why it persisted in society, I think, is a related question. And that has to do with how racism is reproduced in our society. It's not like you can just have a bad idea and it just keeps going on and on and on in perpetuity. It has to be reproduced. And its reproduction is connected to changes, and it adapts to changes in society. So part of the reason why the idea of Chinese being coolies persisted for so long was, one, because we had exclusion laws that lasted until the middle of the 20th century. And we also had, the United States had waged many wars in the Asia Pacific region throughout the 20th century, which also on their own kind of dynamism reproduced stereotypes about Asian people.
It's so interesting. I was also struck, your book does such a nice job of showing how capitalism itself shapes our conceptions of race. I think sometimes in sort of modern discourse, you hear about, empire is racist, capitalism is racist, but it's not merely about reifying inequalities. It's actually shaping our very perception of a race of people. So can you talk a bit about that? I just thought the way that you melded economics and empire and race was just completely original. So if you could talk a little bit about that theme as well.
One of the phrases that I use in the book is that there was an alchemy of race and money in the 19th century, two strands that came together in a very powerful way that resulted in the racialization and marginalization of Chinese around the world, especially in the Anglophone world, and also contributed to the isolation of China itself, right? So what I mean by race and money, by race, I mean the ways in which difference is constructed, especially as a product of colonialism in the 19th century. And by money, I mean first, I guess in this instance, gold, right? And the role that gold played, not just in the specific gold rushes where individuals and corporations and nations got rich, but also how that the volume of gold added to the world store facilitated the world to go to an international gold standard, which was something that Great Britain, who was the premier economic power in the 19th century, led that movement. But that also had an effect on the isolation of China, because China stayed on the silver standard through the middle of the 20th century.
I have to say, I was embarrassed when I was reading your book. I realized I knew about the gold rush vaguely. I knew that at some point, all the great powers in the world used the gold standard. I had not weirdly put the two together. And I love your descriptions of just people digging for money. Like money is mined. Essentially, it's as if we went digging for $20 bills or something. I'm curious, how did this research change your understanding money itself in a way, and what it means and who confers that power. It's just such a bizarre thing that all these people converge and entire environments are changed because people believe that they are finding actual currency.
Well, I think that's why you have gold fever. It's because gold was the money commodity that why people went so crazy to get it. You know, I mean, the gold has been in the rivers, it's been in the mountains for millennia, and indigenous people knew it was there, but they didn't consider gold the money commodity. And so to the extent that native peoples mined gold, or even pre-modern societies like in Mesoamerica, to the extent that they mined gold and silver, it was a store of value. It was used for ornamental purposes to show high social status. But it was not until the early modern era that gold became associated with money, and silver even more so, right? Silver or bimetallism really was much more prominent until the 19th century. So when people see gold as money, then they go crazy. They go crazy, and they do amazing things to get it, to each other, to the environment. I mean, gold mining completely destroyed the environment, and they acted in ways that were, in some ways, very impressive. You know, in terms of technological invention and individual risk taking and daring, right? But they also did a lot of bad things, right, to each other and to the environment. And it's this I mean, there was more gold mined in the second half of the 19th century than in the previous 3,000 years. So that's a lot of gold, and that was only possible because of capitalism, because you needed investors to dig deeply into the earth and to process it, and to have people to do it. You know, those are all features of more advanced industrial societies.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the first Chinese who arrive, right? They hear about this gold fever. I guess, first of all, how did people hear about it? You know, I love, there's a bit of trivia that I'm not going to be able to, I'll always remember now, which is that San Francisco, which in Chinese is, you know, translated as Old Gold Mountain. I didn't realize it was originally Gold Mountain. It became Old Gold Mountain when more was found in Australia. But how on earth are people in southern China? Tell us like where they're coming from, but then also how did they even get word that there was gold to be found in the hills of California?
Well, news of the California gold rush traveled around the world. It traveled first from California to the eastern United States, and it took, you know, almost a year for people in the East to register, right, and with some government approval that there really was gold in California, and then the whole race is on. But you know, I mean, news travels around the world. It's slower, you know. There's no airplanes, and there's certainly no internet, but news travels by ship and by train. And so the first people that go to the gold rush actually are not from the East Coast. They're from Mexico. They're from Chile. They're from Hawaii. They're from the places that California had some trading relationship with. And from Hawaii, there's a trade to China. And so news travels from California to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii to Hong Kong. And that's how the news arrives in Hong Kong about gold in around Christmas time of 1849. And then people write letters, you know, people go and they write letters, and some of them are exaggerated, you know, about the riches that they find, but people go back also and they show people the gold that they have. So it spreads very easily and very quickly.
I was also so interested to hear how much, you know, just how much free trade is associated with all of this, right? It's not just gold, it's an entire kind of local economy that has to be erected overnight where there isn't much to begin with. It sounds like it draws all kinds of people, right? It's not just people seeking gold at the time.
Right. Well, there's an old saying that the people who really got rich from the gold rushes were not the miners, but the merchants, right? The people who came in their train and sold them everything from nails to cotton for tents and food. And a lot of the the merchants in the early days of the California gold rush were Chinese. It was much easier for a ship to bring goods from Hong Kong to San Francisco than it was to transport it from the East Coast. There was, the railroad had not been built yet. The Panama Canal had not been built yet. So the beginnings of trade spurred by the gold rush was really a trans-Pacific trade, and Chinese were very much involved in that. They owned ships. They were consigners of ships. They became very wealthy as merchants. There were merchants in San Francisco who would unload $20,000 of goods and go right back to China and get another shipload. And they also carried passengers, right, who were gold seekers and other kinds of people who were looking to make their own fortune in California.
So of course, this big lie that you're describing is not merely racist. It also has very real ramifications, right, in America's laws. So maybe tell us a bit about how this political fervor around the racism builds toward pretty major policy changes that persist for a really very, very long time.
So the Chinese question arises in the 1850s in California politics, and it's centered around the goldfields. But in the 1860s and 70s, it shifts to become more an urban movement, taken up, and that's in part because a lot of miners, white miners, leave gold mining because the easy pickings have been taken, and now the scene is dominated by big gold mining companies. But the Chinese question kind of rears its head again in San Francisco in the 1870s, in large part as a result of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad did not bring unalloyed prosperity to the West. It brought many more people, which drove down wages. It brought cheap manufactured goods from the East, which flooded the market. And it brought, the long train of the economic depression in the East in the 1870s to the West Coast. So the Chinese question became important or useful again in terms of blaming an outside group for these problems. And that big lie was already there. So it was easily repurposed. And then it becomes really potent in state politics. And the Chinese must go becomes the slogan that dominates the California Constitutional Convention. And the Californians start to lobby in Washington for an exclusion law. And that's an interesting story because here we see white supremacy in the West making an alliance with white supremacy in the South, right? This is a time, late 1870s, 1880, when Reconstruction is turned around and Jim Crow begins to settle in. So it was not as though the whole country just decided to, adopt this racist view. If you read the testimonies or the hearings in the congressional record, you see voices from congressmen from the Midwest or from the East saying, wait a minute, they're not really slaves, are they? I mean, are they really going to ruin the country? I mean, there's a lot of skepticism, but it's this alliance of white supremacy in the South and the West that enables exclusion to push through Congress. And I think that's really interesting because those two sections of the country are still the most conservative, shall we say, on race questions in the United States.
Though I do think just sort of the common knowledge of racism and history, the South is so often the focus because of the Civil War, but I think your book is such a wonderful entry in reminding us of the history of the West and its own kind of separate strand of what happens there. So one thing I also wanted to ask is, the research is just so astonishing, and we have libraries co-sponsoring this event tonight. So I have to ask you, especially the little bit of historic research I've done too, you're really stretching pretty far back. And I just found myself many lines just thinking, how did she find this? Where did she get this? So I'm curious, is there a particular library that you felt was the most exciting for you to do research at? And what did you find there?
Well, I don't know if I want to single out a library and make all the other libraries feel bad.
You can pick more than one.
In the United States, the Huntington Library in San Marino has a vast California and American West collection, and they have a big collection of things from the gold rush. Not all of it is written by Chinese. In fact, most of it is not written by Chinese. But I went through a lot of haystacks to come up with a few needles. So, I would spend an afternoon reading a diary of a young white gold digger, a whole afternoon. But I learned that, he sometimes hired Chinese to work on his claim. He also hired Germans and French, but he hired Chinese also. Sometimes Chinese hired him to help them prospect a claim. And sometimes he tried to sell them a bad claim, and he said, oh, they're getting too wise for this. So it was a lot of, these interesting details that suggested to me that there was a lot of interaction between miners of different backgrounds. Sometimes they worked for one group, sometimes they worked for the other. It was a very fluid situation. And there was cheating going on, but there was also good-natured relations. So that's just one example of, what reading a diary can yield. The libraries in Australia and South Africa were different in the sense that they were government repositories, because the government kept very detailed records of gold mining and claims. There were claims registers. Like in California, you can't find a centralized claim register. You have to find these very small district ones, right? But in Australia, they're centralized by the government. So that was very useful to me because I had a lot more data that was available. And then I could compare it to the little shards that I had from California and say, well, actually, that's very similar. But if I was only looking at California, maybe it wasn't enough to make a pattern. But when I saw that pattern repeated in a very broad way in another place, then I could say, well, that is part of a general pattern. So I don't know, you go through all the haystacks, you line up the needles, you see if you can find a pattern.
The reference you just made to international libraries reminds me, I also wanted to ask you about the global nature of the research and the writing and the subject. So it sounds like from your intro in the book that you set out not to do something quite so global, and that you ended up doing that. At what point did you kind of get to that? I guess I'm so curious, how many years in were you when that happened? Or maybe it was the very beginning. And then how did you feel about taking that on? Because then it's the scale is really different then, of analysis, of research, all of it.
Well, fairly early on, I had visited, I was interested in California. And then I went to a conference in Australia, a conference held by the International Society for the Study of Chinese Overseas. And it was held in Bendigo, which is in the Victorian Gold District. And there's a Chinese museum there. It was fascinating. I said, well, this is really interesting. And it struck me that the Victorian Midlands looked a lot like Northern California, just in terms of the topography. So I just kind of held that. And then I went to another conference sponsored by the same group in Pretoria, South Africa. And there, the experience of Chinese miners was very different, but I thought it might be, another element to compare. So when you do comparison, 3 is a good number. 2 is not enough to really compare, and 4 is like too many. So 3 is the magic number. So I thought I would do some comparison, but I didn't really know what I would find. I didn't know what comparing would yield. So that's what took longer, was to do the research and to think about those patterns, the similarities and the differences. And one of the things that struck me very early on in my Australian research was that they didn't call Chinese coolies. It wasn't part of their racism. They called them heathens. There was too many of them. It was looser, but they didn't call them coolies. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. But it makes sense because in America, that worked because they were comparing Chinese to slaves, to Black slaves. But Australia doesn't have a history of African slavery, right? Its unfreedom tradition is convict transportation. So it struck me then that politics is always local, right? And so then the challenge came to be, how do I understand the local conditions in each place and the politics that emerged? But then how do they were talking to each other too, right? So there's this process whereby the Chinese question morphs as it goes around the world. So then you see the Australians talking just like the Californians, saying they're coolies, right? But that's a borrowing. It's not actually something that generated out of the Australian goldfields. So that was a challenge, but it was a really interesting one, and I enjoyed it a lot.
I do think it makes your book even more special, because I've also been struck, when I was doing the little bit of research I did on immigration, just how international the subject is. It's treated as, especially now, I think in the US, it's treated as such a domestic issue. But then, of course, what you decide to do with people from other countries, those countries pay attention. Right. And they have very strong opinions about what you're doing in it. You're suddenly in a world of foreign relations and international trade. And I just do think that having that kind of corrective that no, immigration is actually a global issue. That's historically how it's been seen is another really powerful theme in your book. What do you, actually, I'm curious what you make of that, the way that immigration is discussed in such it feels to me like a very localized way, like a very US centric way now. And it misses that bigger picture sometimes, I think.
Right. Well, that's because Americans are very self-absorbed and self-centered, right? So we think everything is in terms of just America. But it's not only that how foreign relations affects the immigrants, but it's also how they're received to begin with. Also has to do with the foreign policy relationship that any country has with another. And so and immigration is not it's not a haphazard thing, especially now. It's more, maybe now it is, but through the 19th and much of the 20th century, immigration was it was directed in a sense. I mean, not in the conscious sense that people were saying you go there, although there was some of that, but there are relationships that build up between countries that establish patterns, and then they reproduce. So, why is there such a large migration of Filipinos to the United States? That's just like some random country, right? Why do they send so many people to the United States? Well, because we have a long history with the Philippines, right? It was an American territory, and there's a lot of connections and ties there. I mean, so today people from the Philippines go to other places as well. But for many years, for 100 years or so, the main place people from the Philippines went was to the United States because of that relationship.
Yeah. I'm also curious what you think. Your book is so powerfully about kind of this rapid, really dramatic expansion of the Chinese diaspora, right? And it's certainly in the US, like this is where it comes from. I'm curious what you think about kind of how, actually, I'll interrupt myself to say I'm going to start taking more audience questions in a couple of minutes. So please do put them in the chat. I have a bunch that are great, but I'll start in a little bit. So sorry to interrupt myself. So how would you connect kind of the moment now of the Chinese diaspora? I mean, I'm thinking to be US centric, right? There's many, many more people of Chinese descent in the US, obviously, since this part at the beginning of your book, but also throughout most of American history, there's just so many more people here. So how would you describe kind of the connection between, what do you see as parallels between the diaspora now and what you see in kind of its origins?
The recent Chinese immigrants to the United States, I think they don't really know this history. They're not connected to it. I mean, there's a population of fourth and fifth and sixth generation Chinese Americans who can trace their roots back to the 19th century, but that's a relatively small portion of the Chinese American population. So Chinese Americans and Asian Americans today come under different circumstances. They come from, many more countries than just China. I mean, until the mid 20th century, is mostly China and Japan that sent immigrants to the United States. Now we have Asian Americans from many, many countries. And so I think some people are shocked when they learn about Chinese American history. They said, really? I mean, was it really that violent? Was it really that discriminatory? But you can see you can see legacies of that racism today. The coolie myth, I think, never really went away. A lot of the complaint against Asian American students, college students, is that they're kind of like coolies. They get good grades because they work too hard. They're like robots under the whips of tiger moms. And they don't, it's unfair competition because you can't expect normal American kids to study that much, to study that hard. So it's kind of like a version of the coolie myth, right? It's unfair competition. They work harder than everybody else. They can subsist on a bowl of rice a day. Now it's not a bowl of rice, but it's like they don't have any fun. And I think that idea draws on this very deep well of stereotyping. And it's not a compliment. It's not a compliment to tell them that they do well because they work so hard. It's not a compliment at all. It's a pathology that they're talking about.
It's ultimately just so dehumanizing, right?
Yeah.
Because there also isn't room for the individual. It's the sort of undifferentiated mass of people who are defined by, subservience. And that's just, that very much, unfortunately, I think still is with us. So I want to start turning a little bit to the audience questions. And again, I encourage you all to put them in the Q&A panel here, and I will try to ask as many as I can. So one question we have here is someone asking, how was citizenship conferred at the time of the gold rush? And I would just add here, I find that our immigration system has changed so much that it is hard to imagine it being as different as it was then. So maybe if you can talk through, who was able to be a citizen? Did these Chinese immigrants have any chance of citizenship? What were the laws? What was the process? What did it look like then?
After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment conferred citizenship on all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Not only that, not only national citizenship, but equal citizenship. So Chinese who were born in the United States were citizens by birthright, although that was not recognized until the Supreme Court upheld it in 1898. So that's, 30 years of a kind of gray zone where Chinese Americans' citizenship was in some doubt. Now, the first Chinese exclusion law in 1882 forbid any Chinese to become a naturalized citizen. So naturalization was not possible for Chinese until World War II. But Chinese Americans who were born in the United States were citizens by dint of the 14th Amendment. And that right was upheld in 1898 in a case called Wong Kim Ark.
I have a follow-up to that, which maybe you can talk about that case or anything else that seems relevant. Did people want to become American citizens? So in other words, when the Chinese came, how did they conceive of themselves? Were they people who were, coming for a time for an explicit, almost like personal economic reason? They were always going to be Chinese. They were going to go home at some point. Maybe some didn't go home. How did they conceive of their own Americanness to the degree that they did at all?
I think during the gold rush period and through much of the 19th century, Chinese immigrants who were mostly men, and that's partly by custom, but it's also because women were excluded after 1875. So it was difficult to raise a family in the United States. There were merchants who could bring their wives and did have families, but for the majority of working people, that was much more difficult after 1875. So it's estimated that 50% of the Chinese who came in the late 19th century returned to China. Now, I was talking about Oscar Handlin earlier, right? And this idea that Chinese were sojourners and were not permanent settlers, and therefore they could never become Americans. Well, in point of fact, immigrants from Europe had a return rate of 50% between, say, like 1890 and 1910. So the high tide of Ellis Island immigration from Europe, 50% of those people also went back. And we don't recognize that in our history books, in part because, they've gone, so they're out of sight, out of mind. But it also undermines the theory that all the Europeans came to assimilate. Well, half of them did, but half of them didn't. And for some groups, the return rate was like 80%, for some of the Eastern European groups. So I think in this period of national expansion and industrialization, there was a great appetite for immigrant labor in the United States. And people came to make money to send it home to their family. And a lot of them never had any intention of staying, Chinese and Europeans. But some people stayed nonetheless, even if they hadn't planned to, they end up staying. And eventually families establish and the population accretes by natural reproduction. But I think in many ways the Chinese were not unlike immigrants from other areas. It's just that we have this big lie that tells us that it was qualitatively different, when in fact you can see many similarities between the Chinese and others. Although, it has to be said, though, that the regime of exclusion meant extreme marginalization and discrimination and, narrowing of any kind of chances, life chances, occupational chances in the United States.
I'm getting a couple of questions about assimilation and, these other cultural groups that come and they assimilated, and did the Chinese assimilate too? I guess I'm curious what you think of that word and that concept of assimilation. What is it? What does it mean to you?
Well, it's a word that's very freighted in our both historical and political discourse. Most migration scholars shy away from that word because it has connotations of immigrants becoming like whites, right? Or losing their identities, losing their national identities and becoming American in a way that is an adaptation, but a loss. So many of us prefer to use language like immigrant incorporation, which is a process where people become incorporated in a society through their work, through their jobs, through owning property, having children. But it doesn't have a value judgment about whether they lose their identity or acquire a new identity. I think especially in recent decades, the phenomenon of immigrant living in more than one place has become more and more common, right? So people have transnational lives. They have business connections between the United States and their home country. They have family in both places. Before COVID, you could fly back and forth very easily to visit your family every year, or spend part of the year in your home village or your hometown and part of the year in the United States. We all know people who save up their money so they can retire back in their home country, so you don't have to lose or homogenize, your identity to be an American. I think now, I hope, our view of what it means to be an American is not conditional on erasing our cultural backgrounds or our heritage.
I just got a question here. I've gotten a couple on Canada, so I want to get to that to make sure that we have a global view of things here. Did you find in your research that the US immigration policies were modeled on policies seen elsewhere? The person who writes this is Canadian fourth generation Chinese and curious about who influenced who and how, and is referring to a Chinese Exclusion Act from Canada in 1885.
Right. So 1885, the American law is 1882. So the Canadians took the American law, as they did with much of their immigration law, not just Chinese law. I mean, one of the things I argue in my book is that Chinese exclusion starts in the United States and it works its way around the world, and it's adopted by the British settler countries, or what become known as the Dominions. So it's not just Canada. In Australia, Australia had an unapologetic policy called White Australia policy, which was based on excluding Chinese and other Asians. And that policy borrowed a lot from the United States example. And South Africa had also exclusionary policies that it instituted. So a lot of these, both legally, they varied from place to place, but they all had the same intention, which was to exclude Chinese and other Asians from immigrating and from obtaining citizenship. But the rationale, this idea that the Chinese are a coolie race, what I do in my book is I track how that idea has different forms in different countries, but ultimately becomes a global racial discourse.
Right, that a thing that begins in Sacramento, California, ends up that international is pretty astounding.
Right, it ends up in London.
Right. That's right. Yeah. And probably far more successful than any of the people, I assume, who started, who sort of were building this political project could ever have imagined. Were they aware? I'm curious did they have designs on that kind of global influence, or did it just sort of happen to occur?
Well, as I said, I think Americans are very self-centered, so I don't know to what extent they look around the world, but among the British colonies, they definitely talk to each other, learn from each other. In South Africa, a lot of the white miners in the gold mines were Australians. And South Africa has a fairly large community of Australians that emigrated there. So, there's traffic within the empire, right? People going from different places. And so they had a lot of influence in South Africa. They were actually physical messengers of the White Australia policy. But there was also, exchange going on at the high level of newspapers and magazines, and even political parties. The prime ministers of Australia and New Zealand sent telegrams to South Africa saying, "Don't let the Chinese in. You'll be sorry. You'll be sorry." So you can see all this moving around the world, and it all started in California.
That's pretty amazing. So I think I have time for maybe one or two more questions. One that came in earlier with modern resonance is a pretty blunt one, but essentially, do you think that Chinese Americans will ever be able to escape the racist perpetual foreigner stereotype?
I hope so. I mean, in general, I hope that we're not chained to the views of the past. Although right now it's not a good situation. There's not only the anti-Chinese rhetoric that President Trump, sounded around the virus, but also this current administration is kind of two-faced. On the one hand, they say they're really against racism against Chinese and other Asian Americans, which is good. But on the other side of their mouth, they say China is our biggest adversary. And if the United States pursues an adversarial relationship with China, that is inevitably going to redound to Asian Americans. But what do you think? Do you think we have any cause for hope for a non-racist future?
I hope so. I have a 2-year-old daughter named Ming. I gave her a Chinese name purposefully to to continue that heritage. But I also think race, I mean, to the point of, I think your book is so good at showing how race is a live thing. I think we describe it so often as a concrete thing. So I guess there was the same way that racism can change our conceptions of race. I also feel hopeful that it can go in the other direction too, and that our conception of what it means to be Chinese, what it means to be Asian, can also change. Whatever it was, whatever was hatched by these men in Sacramento does not have to be the fate, forever of an ethnic group or a minority group. I guess what's interesting too is you mentioned the Asian diaspora is also it's way beyond Chinese people. So how do you think did this begin to affect how Koreans were seen, Japanese? Like, what were some of the kind of cross-ethnic implications of all of this too?
I think every Asian ethnic group or nationality group had its own racialization. There's a level of distinctiveness, and then there's a level where they can't tell us apart, right? And it's all the same. So I think you have both dynamics going on. So there's generalizations about Asians, much of which draws on this coolie trope. But it changes because different Asian countries are also different, and they have different histories and different cultures. So racism has to be adaptive enough to, if not make sense, at least to have some kind of surface logic to it, right? So Japan was viewed very differently by the United States than China, right? Especially in the late 19th century, where Japan embarks upon a very aggressive modernization and industrialization program, right? And Japan becomes a formidable power in Asia, in East Asia especially. So the United States looks at Japan as a competitor, and a dangerous competitor, whereas it just sneers at China as being, so weak that they're not afraid of China. They are, but they're not afraid of it in the same way as a competitor, the way they see Japan. And then, during the Cold War, all the alliances switch around because China was an ally, then it became communist, it was the bad guy, and then Japan was the enemy in World War II, but then it became, instrument of American democracy, and so all this stuff kind of spins around, and so ideology became more salient in terms of how different Asian ethnic groups were seen, right? So that becomes a factor. Whereas I think earlier in the 20th century and in the 19th century, ideology didn't get Asians very far, right? It didn't get you very far to say, "Oh, I'm an anti-communist," right? But that had a lot more traction in the mid and late 20th century.
That makes sense, that each group kind of has its own path.
Mm-hmm.
I love how you put it, that they each have their own path, and yet we're all mistaken for each other too. And so there's a way in which it's flattened, which I think, is a whole other subject we could take hours to talk about, which is Asian American identity, right? And
right.
how that comes out of this, and where to go with that too now, given just the sheer ethnic diversity of the group. So I think we are now going to end up closing with a reading from you.
Okay, I'm going to read from a section of chapter 4, which is about that moment in San Francisco and how some Chinese responded. In April of 1852, John Bigler, the governor of California, issued a special message on the Chinese question. Bigler raised alarm over the, quote, present wholesale importation to this country of immigrants from the Asiatic quarter of the globe, in particular that class of Asiatics known as coolies. He declared that nearly all were being hired by Chinese masters to mine for gold at pitiable wages, while their families in China were held hostage for the faithful performance of their contracts. Bigler called upon the legislature to impose heavy taxes on the Chinese to check the present system of indiscriminate and unlimited Asiatic immigration, he said. and for a law barring Chinese contract labor from California mines. What was Bigler's intention? Chinese in California were neither contracted nor indentured labor. But Bigler knew that whites were uneasy about the growing population of Chinese, which had nearly doubled in the past year. Bigler saw political potential in the Chinese question. He had won his first election in 1851 by fewer than 500 votes. With his re-election in 1853 uncertain, he used the Chinese question to excite the populous mining districts to his side. By tarring all Chinese miners as coolies, Bigler found a racial trope that compared Chinese to Black slaves, the antithesis of free labor, and thereby cast them as a threat to white miners' independence. Bigler narrowly won his re-election. His success in tarring the Chinese as a coolie race gave California politicians a convenient scapegoat that could be trotted out whenever conditions demanded it. But more than a political tool, anti-coolieism became a kind of protean racism among whites on the Pacific coast. Now, Tang Dingui was not afraid of John Bigler. Like Bigler and other white elites, Tang was not a miner, but a businessman and a political leader. He hailed from the region that is now called Zhongshan County in Guangdong Province near Macau. He was a leader of the Yanghe Association. He was educated, successful, and fluent in English. Within days of Bigler's message, Tang wrote a letter to the governor. He explained that Chinese in California included laborers as well as tradesmen, mechanics, gentry, and teachers. Quote, none are coolies, if by that word you mean bound men or contract slaves. He added emphatically, the poor Chinaman does not come here as a slave. He comes because of his desire for independence. Tang dismissed as absurd Bigler's claims that the Chinese came to labor for $3 or $4 a month, less than they earned in China. He wrote, it is foolish to believe they will leave their family for trifling inducements. As to the charge that Chinese were a menace to white society, he wrote, there are no Chinese drunkards in our streets, nor convicts in our prisons. In the important matter is we are good men. We honor our parents. We take care of our children. We trade much. We are trusted for small and large sums. We pay our debts and are honest. And of course, we tell the truth. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, May. That is such a sad bit of history, but it is a really wonderful portrait of the core spirit of the Chinese immigrants and their leaders. And all of us have learned so much tonight. We are so grateful to you and the stories of their families as well. It's so interesting and so important to hear. Your book is full of such truths and such stories. Just a reminder for folks out there, signed copies of May and Jilin's book are available from Porter Square Books. You can order online at portersquarebooks.com using the code AMINS20.